Hello FCAT UGC 2022. My name is Amelia and I'm a third-year film student here at SCA. Today I have the privilege to guide you through a glamorous daydream, which is comprised of the cinematic experiences that have woven a tapestry of collective memories that shape what I call the LGBTQ+ pop culture. This is the label I've chosen and that I use in my paper that refers to the normalized queer mediatic landscape that we have today. My paper demonstrates how we got to that point through multiple layers of glamorous prosthetic memories. So there's a lot to unpack here in terms of history and also in terms of definitions. So I'm going to start by defining a few terms for you. So prosthetic memory is defined by Alison Landsberg as a public or widespread narrative about the past that informs our subjectivity. The guiding argument of this paper is basically that the prosthetic memories formed by codes of queerness exemplified by Glamour in classical Hollywood and then later recalled in queer films of the 90s or during the AIDS crisis shaped the way that not only the queer community but also the rest of wider straight society perceives other queer people and experiences. So by examining how queer films from the 90s nostalgically recall classical Hollywood aesthetics and codes, my paper argues that it is primarily the widespread visibility of these references in popular films made during the epidemic that slowly helped to reshape the collective memory of queerness, both the queer community's collective memory as well as that of wider society. Basically, this argument aims to highlight how the development of this kind of normalized queer mediatic landscape has affected queer people born during and after the epidemic, such as myself, especially because the deaths en masse due to the epidemic created a disruption in the line of knowledge that would usually be passed down from one queer person to the next. Another important reference for this paper was actually Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet, published in 1981. Initially in queer scholarship and later in general film scholarship, this book sparked conversation around closet mentality and culture and what that meant for representation of queer people in the media. Woven through every concept discussed in The Celluloid Closet, closet culture refers to the silent participation of queer filmmakers to their own erasure from said media. So needless to say that closet mentality was firmly internalized by queer people and also straight people when the Hays Motion Picture Production Code came into enforcement. And this code was in place, the set of rules was in place from 1934 to the late 1960s. So it spanned basically all of the classical Hollywood era. Amongst interracial marriage and nudity, this set of rules put in place by the Motion Picture Producers Association banned what they called sexual perversion, which inherently referred to homosexuality. During this time, queer people basically had two choices. They had to cease existing in media altogether, which should never be an option, or they had to find ways to hide in plain sight, which is actually exactly what they did. In order to succeed, they had to create verbal, metaphorical, and visual codes and cues. So my paper is about Glamour, which is arguably one of the most visually evident codes for queerness that exist, because it is as much a fashion style with its dazzling sequins, beautiful feathers, and bright makeup as it is an attitude or, portrayed as an attitude or a way of life. In his book, Hard to Imagine, Thomas Waugh outlines the importance of glamour for queer photographic and cinematic works by highlighting it or describing it as a manifestation of daydreams used by queer people to offset economic deprivation and social powerlessness that they faced every day in real life. At the peak of classical Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s, gay men looked towards the leading ladies of these popular films as stand-ins for themselves. These experiences of glamour, both aesthetic and behavioral, are the vehicle for nostalgia in the mainstream queer stories that are put to screen in the 1990s. So the principal examples of 90s queer film that I have outlined in my paper to demonstrate this point are To Wong Foo and Velvet Goldmine. In To Wong Foo, the drag queen Miss Vida, played by Patrick Swayze, funnily enough, her drag style is very reminiscent of classical Hollywood. So when she's not wearing long, flattering gowns, Vita dons matching blazer and skirt two-pieces, large brimmed hats with feathers or other ornaments, head shawls, large earrings, jewelry, you name it. Velvet Goldmine is an important example to this paper, in a little bit less of a straightforward way, because it actually inspires the guiding metaphor of this research paper. The green amulet from the movie is passed down along a long line of queer people, from Oscar Wilde to Jack Ferry to Brian Slade to Arthur Stewart, the fictional journalist in the film and the last recipient of the amulet in the story. The amulet isn't just a representation of glamour itself and all the stars that have possessed it, but also their knowledge, and the knowledge that they bequeath through this amulet of glam rock and queer culture. This precious pin has evaded the curse of time as a symbol of renewal and reincarnation, because whoever possesses it is reborn in a glittery whirlwind of queer freedom and is no longer bound by reality and only limited by its owner's will or imagination, essentially. So I have such limited time, and this topic is obviously so incredibly nuanced that this can only be a very simplified overview. But the last topic that I cover are the erasures and absences of women, people of color, and gender non-conforming people in queer cinematic history. Obviously, Paris is Burning made waves, but during the AIDS crisis, gay men were the most affected group, and they were often the ones most often mediatized. That is not to say that films by queer people of color didn't exist, or gender non-conforming people didn't exist. Take, for example, Cheryl Delnier's The Watermelon Woman, which is the first movie by a black lesbian about black lesbians. Essentially, the point of my paper is that glamour is ingrained in the prosthetic memories of queerness of both queer and straight people born during and after the AIDS epidemic. And it was an important code that affected much of the new increasing representation of queer stories on the big screen. These are the films that, just like Velvet Goldmine's Amulet, while using glamour as a continued celebration of queerness, will be able to open a more diverse, intergenerational dialogue in the queer community itself, building up what we lost from the AIDS epidemic. So the reason for this paper is essentially because it was a part of a directed study, or the goal of a directed study rather, with Joe Clark, who is a film historian that works as a prof here at SCA. So I originally applied for a directed study with him because I wanted a deeper and more precise look at film history, more than our intro courses at least. In the course we did a section based on trauma, and I watched How to Survive a Plague, which is a documentary about the AIDS crisis and the fight for many queer activist groups like ACT UP. This film kind of led me to wonder how trauma manifested on the screen in other ways. So in thinking of representation, I kind of started thinking about myself and how historically different representations of people like me, queer people, have potentially affected me and have created assumptions and internalized biases within myself. Following this course and writing this paper, I definitely discovered more and more about film history, so, goal accomplished. But it also allowed me to explore two distinct parts of myself, my own path in history as a filmmaker, and then similarly as a queer person, but also, most importantly, as a queer filmmaker. I want to thank you for listening to my presentation today, and I hope that you learned a thing or two and are as excited about this project and this topic as I am. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the conference and that you stay to listen to my wonderful contemporaries and colleagues who have really incredible projects to present as well.